Welcome to our discussion of Daisy Miller. I'm going to tell you about the first part in this video. So on my screen here, I have two different things. The first is Daisy Miller. This is by Project Gutenberg. This is what I posted on Canvas and where you can read it. The second thing is our literary terms. And these can be found, there's a link on Canvas. It's called Literary Terms, American Literature Spring 2020. So we're going to talk about a few new ones today. But before we move into that, I want to talk about a few different aspects of the first part of Daisy Miller that you should know about. So the first is setting. And if you remember back in our literary terms, setting is the time and place that a literary work occurred. So we have to have those two elements. So I ask you on the test about setting, you need to know both the time period and the place. So if we go to Daisy Miller, it doesn't say it directly in the first part when it's happening, but it's set in Vevey in Switzerland, and it's about some Americans who are visiting Switzerland. So our characters are American, they're staying in Europe for extended amounts of time. Daisy is American, so is Frederick Winterbourne and Randolph. So we have a bunch of Europeans that are there, and it happens in the late 1800s, in the 1880s to be precise. And this is when Henry James lived. So he's kind of writing about his own time period. And in our realism presentation, we said that he's a realist, so he's trying to kind of capture how things were in the time. So that is our setting. And then if we move on to talk about point of view, it's tempting if we start reading it to say that it's in third person because it uses he and she, the characters speak to each other. But the very beginning sets it up a little bit differently. If we look at the second full paragraph here, we get this word I. I hardly know whether it was the analogies of the differences I have mentioned. If we keep scrolling down, this whole second paragraph mentions I several times. So our narrative is actually told by an unknown narrator, and it is in first person. Now, our narrator only seems to know the thoughts of Winterbourne. And that's his last name, right? His first name is Frederick, his last name is Winterbourne. So we're going to call it first person limited because it only knows Frederick Winterbourne's thoughts, but it's told in first person even though our narrator is kind of removed and it reads a lot like it's in third person. And this is a little bit strange. The effect is that it's a bit like gossip, almost like our narrator has overheard it from someone and is passing it along. So the whole story is told in first person limited. And I'd like to go ahead and move into the plot, talk about sort of what happens and how this is realist literature, kind of along the way. So we've said at the very beginning, we have Frederick Winterbourne who's staying in this kind of resort, this hotel in Switzerland. And then if we keep reading a little bit in the plot, the first character that he meets is a small boy. His name is Randolph, though it doesn't tell us right at the beginning. And he has this kind of interesting conversation with him. In this passage, we see a lot of realism. Like the word hard is spelled out here as if he's saying it. And a lot of the characteristics of the little boy match what little boys are actually like. He's really into candy. He doesn't want to be traveling in Europe. So it's trying to portray the way little boys actually are and show kind of ordinary people and what they are like. You'll notice at the very beginning that they make a really big deal about being Americans. And this is because it's in a European setting. They're still thinking about their own nationalities and what it means to be an American, even though it's set in this European setting. So it starts out with him meeting this little boy. His sister comes up shortly, and they kind of have this moment where they could meet, but it's unclear if they're supposed to meet. If we look down, the sentence starts, in Geneva, as he has been perfectly aware. And I think it is useful if you use the Control F and find things. So if you don't know where it is in the passage, you can just look up in Geneva as he had been perfectly aware. So I've typed in Geneva as he. It says, in Geneva, as he had been perfectly aware, a young man was not at liberty to speak to a young unmarried lady, except under certain rarely occurring conditions. But here in Vevey, what conditions could be better than these? A pretty American girl coming and standing in front of you in a garden. So we see here that Winterbourne has been gone from America for a while. He's not used to the customs of Americans anymore, and it kind of shows that he doesn't really understand his own nationality, what it means to be an American. And this is a tension that kind of comes up throughout the entire short story. Anyway, they do end up talking here, and they have a pretty interesting conversation. She's really open, she's really frank. She tells him about her family being from New York, about her father being well off. And then she mentions one thing. I'm going to look up the only thing I don't like. And this is what she's talking about, her experience in Switzerland. The only thing she doesn't like is the society. She says there isn't any society, or if there is, I don't know where it keeps itself. So we see here that she's a little bit of an outsider. As an American, she doesn't quite know how to fit in. And this also plays into the plot and kind of the tensions between them. As it goes on, they have this conversation, and he promises he's going to take her to the Chateau de Chillon. And it's this old castle that she really wants to visit. So Winterbourne promises that he's going to take her, but along the way with them talking about it, her mother comes up and they start talking some, and it quickly becomes clear that her mother is not all that pleased that he's there. So they don't make any definite plans. He promises to introduce her to his aunt, and that, in his account, is his way of sort of showing that he has good character, that he's willing to introduce her to his aunt to show that he has a reputable character. But surprisingly, his aunt does not want to meet her. And this is going to be on the quiz. So I'd recommend looking up exactly why Mrs. Costello, or his aunt, doesn't want to meet with Daisy Miller. That will be on the quiz, even though I'm not going to discuss it right now. But in any case, his aunt won't meet her. He doesn't really know what to do about it. When he's forced to run into her, he brings it up slightly. She's a little bit embarrassed. She tries to kind of make it into a joke, but we can tell that it kind of hurts her feelings, and it shows how she's sort of excluded. She's not a part of high society. They talk about going on this night boat ride. They don't end up going that night. However, later on in the first part, they do end up going to the Chateau de Chillon, or this castle, and they kind of go back and forth the whole time. He's thinking all about her, what she's really like. He's kind of been going back and forth about her character this whole time anyway. And they're at this castle. Sometimes he feels he's deeply in love with her. Sometimes he feels like she's a common person. He doesn't really understand her. But at the end of the whole castle thing, they kind of both announce they're leaving. And she has this line where she says, "I think you're horrid." And then she does nothing but call him horrid for the next 10 minutes. And he's sort of beside himself because it shows that she cares about him in some way. So it ends on kind of this note where they both leave and we're not sure if they're going to see each other again. The aunt still didn't want to know her, but it leaves kind of in the middle of this relationship that they have. So that's our basic plot. Not too much happens in the first part. But I did want to talk about two literary terms in this first part, and the first one is flat character. So I'm going back to our literary terms here. These are at the very end of the document. So a flat character is a character who lacks depth or complexity. So some of our flat characters in this first part are Randolph, the younger brother, Mrs. Miller, her mother, Eugenio, who's their courier, and Mrs. Costello, who are the aunt. These are the kinds of people that get stereotyped. We can describe them in just a sentence or two. It doesn't go deeply into their psychologies. But then we also have two very round characters. And a round character is a fully developed character with the complexity and depth of a real person. So here our roundest character is Frederick Winterbourne. The entire first part, as I'm sure you noticed as you read it, is kind of going back and forth on his psychology. We get to know exactly how he thinks, how he perceives the people around him, and the main thing that he's focused on is understanding Daisy's position. It's like he doesn't understand how she fits into society, and he finds her really attractive as a person, but he doesn't quite understand the ways that she acts. So I'm going to take you through just two quick quotes about her. The first one, he says, he's talking to his aunt and kind of describing what his opinion of her is. And he says, "You really think that she's the sort of young lady that expects the man sooner or later to carry her off." So he's wondering if she's going to just go off with someone and get married. And if she doesn't have any sort of class, if she's going to defy all the social conventions. And then later on, when he takes her to the castle, He says he finds her an extraordinary mixture of innocence and crudity. She's an American and she has this honest way of talking that really surprises him. And because we see her through his eyes, we also understand her as a round character. We see that she has all these contradictions like a real person has. So these two characters are very round. We get to see a lot about them, and the others are kind of flat. The person that coined these terms, E.M. Forster, thought that some characters need to be round and some need to be flat. So we get kind of this mixture in every short story. That concludes what we're going to say about part 1. So you can go ahead and take the quiz for part 1 now after you've seen the realism PowerPoint.